Hello everyone, Ace here, and today I've decided to have yet another look at some video game history, and in the process answer the question, what exactly made Star Wars Dark Forces great? First released all the way back in 1995 for the PC, with a port to the PlayStation 1, and much later getting a remaster, footage of which is utilized throughout this video, Star Wars Dark Forces stands as the first entry of the Dark Forces / Jedi Knight series of Star Wars games, a series that has produced some of the most beloved Star Wars games of all time, of which Star Wars Dark Forces is no exception. It is a landmark title as far as Star Wars is concerned, and deserves its place as being among the most important games within the Star Wars universe. But to understand why this is the case, let's talk about what exactly made the game great. And to rip the band-aid right off, the first thing that made the game great is that it proved that yes, first-person shooters can absolutely work within the Star Wars setting. Okay, that might not sound like that much of a surprise. Even back then, there are several reasons to suggest that yes, a first-person shooter would absolutely work within the setting, what with there being several different flavors of blaster as well as bowcaster being established within the lore, even within the films. And with Star Wars being a fairly large and expansive setting, it is fairly easy to, of course, introduce brand new pieces of equipment and weaponry into that particular setting, provided you don't break established lore to do it. Still, we did ultimately have to start somewhere, and with Star Wars Dark Forces, the game came out at a fantastic time, not only fairly early on in the golden age of Star Wars themed video games, but also during the age of the Doom clone. And as far as Doom clones are concerned, Star Wars Dark Forces is particularly well executed. Gunning down hordes of stormtroopers never gets old, and the game has absolutely zero problems with throwing tons of them at you, with there often being several piles of stormtroopers before the end of any particular level. Speaking of levels, I believe that moves us on quite nicely to another thing that helped make the game great: the engine it ran on. For those who don't know, Star Wars Dark Forces ran on the Jedi engine, which was of course developed in-house by LucasArts, and was actually comparable to Ken Silverman's Build engine. And while history would dictate that the Build engine would be the more famous and successful of the two, there were numerous ways in which the Jedi engine was superior. Case in point, Room Over Room, which was an out-of-the-box feature for the Jedi engine, albeit of course with some limitations. And while Room Over Room could be achieved with the Build engine, in that case it was never an intended supported feature, and instead developers had to utilize various tricks in order to accomplish it. Yes, the Build engine did have its own unique advantages, but despite the relative lack of games that the Jedi engine was utilized in, due to the fact that it was an in-house proprietary engine, used exclusively by LucasArts, it was nevertheless a very capable engine from the era. And let's not also forget that both this engine and this game were released during one of the most rapid paces of development within video game history. This was right in the middle of the transition from 2D to 3D, an age in which even within the time span of in some cases a single year, a game that might be state-of-the-art one year might be considered dated in terms of visuals by the next. And for what it's worth, again, Star Wars Dark Forces and the Jedi engine was, for a brief moment in history, among those envelope pushers. But it wasn't just in the realm of video games alone that we can find things that helped make Star Wars Dark Forces great. Another element I should bring up as to what exactly made Star Wars Dark Forces great is the expansion of Star Wars lore. For example, it was ultimately Star Wars Dark Forces that first established the Dark Trooper project by the Empire. Dark Troopers would of course go on to play a substantial role in numerous Star Wars games since, and it is curious to note that their port of origin, at least as far as the canon is concerned, that is to say the old EU canon and not the Disney canon, is ultimately Star Wars Dark Forces. But Star Wars Dark Forces also established some rather beloved characters within the Star Wars universe as well, most most notably the game's protagonist, Kyle Katarn, the man, the myth, the legend himself, a former Imperial officer now turned mercenary for hire, working with the Rebel Alliance. Kyle Katarn would end up going through one of the more notable character arcs throughout Star Wars over the course of the Dark Forces / Jedi Knight games. Admittedly, much of this character arc occurs in the later games, but still the sheer introduction of this character is enough to warrant praise for Star Wars Dark Forces on its own. So while he might not have been the lightsaber twirling master of the Force that he would be in later games, he is still pretty formidable in this game nevertheless. And again, like I said, this game does ultimately set up his character, or at least the start of it in any case. So in summary, at the end of the day, Star Wars Dark Forces is a game that significantly expanded upon existing Star Wars lore, establishing not only the Dark Trooper program, but also the legend that is Kyle Katarn as a character. It also was the first proper first-person shooter set in the Star Wars universe, meaning not only is it a notable title on the road to the rest of the Dark Forces / Jedi Knight games, but it is also an important title on the road to the Star Wars Battlefront series, both of the Star Wars Battlefront series, as well as of course Star Wars Republic Commando to some degrees. In addition to all of that, it was built on an engine that was actually rather advanced for the time, offering admittedly limited, but still nevertheless noteworthy competition to the absolute dominance of the build engine in that era, at least for first-person shooters. This is all of course on top of the fact that the game is simply a blast to play. It's not exactly a particularly difficult game, but the action is frantic and fast-paced, and the enemies are incredibly satisfying to blast through, which you will of course be doing a lot of. I could also praise the quality of the cutscenes leading you into the various missions, which might not be the greatest in the world, but are still perfectly respectable and still a cut above most FPS games from the era. And then there of course is the soundtrack, which manages to absolutely nail the theme of Star Wars. It is a soundtrack that is completely fitting within the setting, and it is also original music as well, which is to say not simply ripped directly from the films themselves verbatim. But ultimately, I'd say the biggest selling point, aside from the main things that made this game great, was simply, like I said, that it was fun to play. And still remains fun to play. And a lot of times, that's ultimately what it really comes down to, is a game simply fun to play. And that most definitely is the case with Star Wars Dark Forces. With all of this in mind, this has been Ace, and I hope you'll agree when I say that Star Wars Dark Forces is great.